Well, thank you all. I understand that from John Ferranda that the Dreier Roundtable has actually broken new ground here. John said never before has he seen so many Claremont McKenna College students awake at 8:30 in the morning. And so we feel as if we're really breaking new barriers here, and it's something that is impressive. My name is David Dreier, and I've not been campaigning, but you're never supposed to apologize, but I apologize for not having my voice as strong as it normally is. But I want to welcome all of you here, and I want to say that we're waiting for Jaime. What has happened here is we are today assembling the group of people who are responsible for what has been described by at least one of our presidential candidates as the single worst disaster in world history. And the goal that we have is to bring about an opportunity for people to understand the facts. I mean, we're all told that everybody's entitled to their own opinion. No one is entitled to their own facts. And I believe that today we are going to shed some light on an issue which has become such a high priority in this presidential campaign. When I left the Congress 3.5 years ago, President Gann then talked about the notion of establishing a center here, and we had centers and institutes, and then Hiram Chodosh became the president of CMC, and he came up with this brilliant idea of establishing a roundtable that is being built on the work that I did in the Congress for, are you ready for this, a third of a century. I was there for 32 years, and for those of you I haven't met before, I won my party's nomination when I was working here, a student at CGU, living in Phillips Hall. And so it's been a long time since then. And for me, it was really interesting. I was actually working for Don Rosen in November of 1979 when Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for President of the United States. It was November 13th of 1979. And in that announcement of his candidacy for president, I had lost my first election. I was sort of between my elections. I encourage you to look up Ronald Reagan's announcement speech for president, because in that speech, he basically said the same thing that Hillary Clinton is being maligned for having said in her speech to a Brazilian banking group. Ronald Reagan said, "I envisage an accord of free trade, encouraging the free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people among all the Americas." Ronald Reagan said that in 1979 when he announced that he was running for president. I was privileged to be elected to the Congress the next year, the same day Ronald Reagan was elected president. I went to my first meeting out of the country. It was to the U.S.-Mexico Interparliamentary Conference, and there was a guy called Jose Lopez Portillo, who was the president of Mexico at that point. In that meeting, I foolishly said that we should think about this idea that Ronald Reagan had propounded, the idea of breaking down barriers and encouraging that free flow. The Democrats and Republicans from the United States laughed at me when I said it, and the Mexicans all laughed at me when I raised this in a meeting in 1981, in May of 1981. And then in 1987, I joined with two of my colleagues and actually introduced legislation that called for the elimination of tariff barriers among Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The U.S.-Canada agreement had been put together at that juncture, and we were able to work in a bipartisan way, and I am so thrilled to have my two great friends, Jaime Serra Puche, who served as the Commerce Secretary under President Salinas in Mexico, Treasury Secretary. He was the lead dog when it came to the issue of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and I'm particularly thrilled that my longtime friend, the chairman of the Clinton for President 1992 campaign, then U.S. Trade Representative and Secretary of Commerce Mickey Cantor, is joining us here today. And so this is a group of people who have an interesting history, but I guarantee you every single person here is looking to the future which is exactly what we need to do. So I just want to express my appreciation to all of you for being here. I'm not an economist. I'm simply a graduate of CMC. The only thing I'm expert on is my own opinion, nothing else. But, and I don't hesitate to share it. I'm thrilled to have President Stark and Jill Stark here. I mentioned the Rosens, my friend Elliot Broidy, my almost classmate Mark Schwartz, and so many other people who have played a big role in my life for what I think is an absolutely amazing institution. And I will say from dinner last night, and I should say this to you, Jill and Jack, that it took me, I was telling Hiram last night, it took me about 6 months before I really liked this place when I enrolled. And I've met a number of the freshmen here. Never before have I had people who from day one coming here, every single day, they are more and more enthusiastic and positive about the experience they're having here at CMC. And so I know I couldn't get in. I claimed last night that I knew Hiram Chodash and I might have gotten in, and he said he basically would have trashed me. So I can say with absolute certainty, I could not have gotten in now, and I congratulate all of you who were in fact able to. So now, I also want to express appreciation to the leadership of the world-famous Dreier Roundtable. Eric Helland and Ken Miller. Ken worked for me, was an intern and worked for me in Washington. He's a Pomona alumnus, but as he said, made the right move to CMC. And I also have to say that Zach Corser has done a phenomenal job in putting all of this together. We are the brainchild of Hiram Chodash, but what we've brought together is the first interdisciplinary effort. He's an economist, Ken is a political scientist, and so CMC has not in the past been able to get over that gap among different departments, and these two are doing it with our roundtable, and I'm particularly proud of that. So our ringleader for this effort is the great Eric Helland. Go get him.
Always a pleasure. So thank you all for coming out. The purpose of our talk is to talk first about sort of trade, but perhaps more the populist moment we find ourselves in, where there's been a very real backlash against trade. I think this is the first time in my lifetime that we don't have a pro-trade presidential candidate running in the United States, at least if you take what they say at face value. So I'm really thrilled that we have this panel.
They're all pro-trade. They don't say that they're anti-trade.
Fair enough. They're for trade on their terms, which is kind of the definition of not free trade. So I wanted to start off. Obviously, we've got a distinguished panel. I leave it to you to read their bios in the materials, but I just wanted to give a very quick introduction. Obviously, everyone knows the Honorable David Dreier, our namesake for the Dreier Roundtable. 32 years in the House of Representatives, and as he mentions, key in the passage of NAFTA. Dalibor Rohac is a research fellow at AEI. He focuses his scholarship on the EU, and his most recent book is Towards an Imperfect Union, the Conservative Case for AEI, which may make you the only anti-Brexit person in the AEI building. But the reason Dalibor is here is to sort of talk about this in a broader perspective, not just NAFTA, not just North America, but what's been going on in Europe, where we see sort of similar phenomenons. Jaime Serra Puche had a great introduction already from David, so I'll merely say that he is was the Commerce Secretary for Mexico during the NAFTA negotiations, directed the NAFTA negotiations in that position, is the president and founder of SAI consultancies, and most important, a very distinguished honor, a CMC parent.
Twice parent, Twice.
Two times. Yes.
Two times.
Which, by the way, is more than the rest of us on this panel, who can claim only one CMC. Guillermo. 2-1-1.
Right.
Guillermo Aguilar-Alvarez is the principal legal counsel for Mexico during the NAFTA negotiations. He's a member of King and Spalding's International Group and a professor at Yale Law School, and also a CMC parent. And his son is in the audience, who's been graciously helping handing out the flyers you have that are part of this. So without further ado, I'm going to get sort of right to the questions. And Guillermo, I thought I'd direct this first one to you. Our audience is primarily undergrads, and one of the things I think it would be useful for us to understand is sort of where does NAFTA the much maligned, what was the quote? Worst trade deal in history.
Oh, yeah. The worst deal ever
worst deal
in world
ever.
history. I mean, everything gets worse and worse every day.
Hyperbole runs amok.
Yeah.
But where does it fit into the world trading system? What's the sort of the architecture? So if you could just give us kind of a brief history of sort of how we got here. And then, Dalibor, I want to turn it over to you to just talk a little bit about the EU in that context. So just a little context for our
Well,
audience.
to set the stage, I would start with the WTO. The WTO manages the multilateral trading system. It comprises several agreements that liberalize trade and introduce discipline in other areas, like, for example, subsidies or anti-dumping, intellectual property, investment. Fundamentally, the WTO agreements adopt a principle of non-discrimination. What does this mean? It means that a WTO member cannot treat other WTO members better. It has to treat them all the same. However, at the same time, because the WTO is a multilateral agreement, with the difficulties that entails in moving the trade agenda ahead, since 1947, since the GATT agreements, it is recognized that members of the WTO may enter into regional agreements without breaching that principle of non-discrimination. And multiple free trade agreements and the European Customs Union emerge from this exception to the principle of non-discrimination in the GATT. So what is the difference between a free trade agreement and a customs union? Strictly from a trade perspective, all members of a customs union have a common external tariff. In other words, that common external tariff applies to all imports to the union, regardless of the point of entry of the imported good. That doesn't happen in free trade agreements. In free trade agreements, members of a free trade area are free to apply different import tariffs to countries outside the free trade area. And more generally, I would say that customs unions achieve a much higher degree of integration than free trade areas, which typically do not provide for example, labor mobility or a common currency. But I'm sure that Dalibor will touch on that in his comments. So at a very basic level, that is how NAFTA and customs unions fit into the world trading system.
So Dalibor, I want to sort of pick up on Guillermo's sort of, if we think about the EU sort of relative to sort of NAFTA, what would the important differences be for sort of our audience? How should we think about these just for the context of our discussion going forward?
I think the critical difference really is that the EU and the European project generally is a much deeper form of integration than any other regional free trade associations or customs unions. It's deeper at the economic level, partly because it entails a concerted long-term effort at dismantling non-tariff barriers, either through mutual recognition or through some form of regulatory convergence. And as a result, the European single market really operates much more like what the founding fathers of the United States described as the principle of interstate commerce. A product or a service legally allowed in one member state can't be denied entry in another member state, can be denied being marketed elsewhere. And that's a much stronger principle than one that animates most free trade areas or customs unions. There are many exceptions to this general principle, and that's where one can have quibbles with the current state of the European integration, and most importantly in the service sector. The completion of the single market is still very far away. But apart from just economics, the European Union is different from other free trade arrangements or customs unions by having a very strong political component. European EU member states do not just agree to let goods and services flow between themselves. They have committed to policy coordination in a whole range of areas. There is a single currency. There is now a common external border refugee protection policy as part of the so-called Schengen area of passportless travel. There is all sorts of policy areas that you wouldn't even think of as being necessarily coordinated at the European level are in some level affected by this layer of European rules and legislation. As a result, there are political institutions created at the European level, European Parliament, European Council, European Commission, that provide almost basic elements of a federal state. It's very far from being a federal state, but it's much more than just a free trade arrangement. And I think what's underpinning this political dimension is the history. Post-war history of Europe has been one that's been built around the recognition that unless some supranational mechanism for coordinating interests of different countries is devised, Europe, as it had many times in its history, will revert to nationalism, protectionism, and potentially conflict. So there is a sense in which the EU has been built as a peace project, really, and I think that's something that's really important when you think about the politics of the European integration.
Can I just ask a question of Dalibor on this? So today, what's in the news on this is right now the role that Belgium is playing, standing in the way of the EU-Canada FTA. Yep. And I'm wondering, I'm interested to know what you think, as you describe the uniqueness of the EU as a bloc juxtaposed to other organizations in the world, what you think is going to happen and what's on the horizon there. And maybe you could just a little bit about Belgium's role in trying to block the FTA.
I think the Canadian-EU trade agreement that was in the news, that has been in the news lately, provides a fine example of how complicated the EU really is and how far it is from a properly functioning federation. So at some level, the EU has the exclusive prerogative to negotiate a trade agreement with third countries such as Canada or the United States, where there is TTIP being negotiated. But when it comes to actually translating those agreements into practice, right now we are just talking about only signing the agreement with Canada. There are great many veto points. So at some point, actually Sigmar Gabriel, the Deputy Chancellor of Germany, decided that it would be a good idea for every country to have a say in the signing process. And the hurdle that we've sort of encountered was in Belgium, where a region named Wallonia decided that its agricultural interests were so important that this whole deal should be brought to a stop. Yesterday, however, an agreement has been reached that allows Belgian government to sign CETA, with the caveat that some of the investment-related provisions of CETA will not apply until there is a decision of the European Court of Justice on their legality. So the signing process can go ahead, but we are still very far from having this agreement translated into practice. Still needs to be ratified by 28 member states.
So let me turn the questions to Jaime and ask, I mean, we've sort of heard how the integration works. We haven't yet had a discussion about why you might want to do this. So I thought I'd just sort of kick this over to the fellow economist for why, what are the benefits of trade? What is if we think about why economies would want to sort of remove this tariff barriers, and sort of, I suppose there's the classic case from David Ricardo based on comparative advantage, but I feel like it goes sort of much deeper than that. So if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about this.
Sure. Let me say probably the best explanation is the motto Claremont College has, which says civilization prospers with trade, but it's in Latin. So I invite you to look at the motto of the college, and then, it's some justification of why free trade makes sense. My feeling is that, that the current debate about free trade and protectionism is one, that is completely irrational. Because, particularly on the NAFTA debate, I think that what is happening is that the debate among the candidates in the US has not gone into pretty basic stuff that you have to look into it. The first one is that, and we heard this from Guillermo and now from our colleague from the European explanation, is that the world trade has changed in a major way. If you look, I prepare a little handout, and if you please look at the graph under L that says current regional trade agreements. The world is now trading among regional agreements, or regional areas. More than 50% of world trade is happening on the preferential trade agreements. So we're seeing more and more that the competition is not among countries, but among regions. So I think that is one first element that is absolutely crucial. The second one is that if you look at what has happened in 20 years of NAFTA, since Congressman Dreier helped us, Mickey Cantor and I negotiated, and most importantly, Guillermo Aguilar drafted it. So he's the real stuff in that process. Things have changed dramatically in 20 years. And the three economies have integrated massively over these 20 years, to the point where now we are not selling to each other, not only selling to each other, we are producing jointly in the North American region. We are in a process of co-production. So what happens is that now really the region should act as a one element or component of the whole trade arena. And when you talk about the possibility of having a free trade agreement between Canada and the Europeans, and potentially having the TTPI between the US and Europe, I had presented the idea to the US government that probably the rational decision on that negotiation with Europe would be to have a free trade agreement between NAFTA and the Europeans. Mexico already has a free trade agreement with Europe. The Canadians apparently are going to have it soon. The US is starting to negotiate in a very shy way after all this political noise. So I think that the policymakers in the future in the US should consider the possibility of having a NAFTA European Union negotiation, which would lower transaction costs dramatically, would improve competitiveness for the firms in the regions and so on. So when you look at the results of free trade, you realize that there are many welfare gains. And the fact that Ricardo presented this idea many, many years ago, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Actually, it's right, and I think it has prevailed in many debates and academic exercises. Let me just explain to you very quickly why I think that the debate has been wrong over the last weeks or months. And by the way, surprising how important it is in the debate, as you were saying. But if you go to the beginning of this handout, I made a little exercise producing an index for integration, where you see that integration in North America has been going up dramatically since the NAFTA was implemented, as is shown in graph A. Our economic cycles are very much coordinated, and you look at graph B, and you'll see that before NAFTA, the correlation between industrial production in the US and in Mexico was around 20%, and now we're closer to 70%. So our cycles, economic cycles in North America are sort of coordinating themselves. And then very basic macroeconomic variables such as inflation, interest rates, and exchange rate are converging in the region. So when you look at all of that, really we're talking about one region and not three countries from the economic standpoint. And any decision that might introduce protectionism within the region is going to be very inefficient. It will imply that we're going to be shooting our own foot. Because right now, in terms of world trade, Mexico and the US are not sitting on the opposite side of the table. Now Mexico, Canada, and the US are sitting on the same side of the table for future trade negotiations. So my view is that NAFTA and all the free trade that it brought along, with all the structure that Guillermo can explain, is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And it's very important that we understand that the policy decisions that are taken by the US, which is the dominant player within the NAFTA region, takes into account that Mexico provides competitiveness to the region, that Canada provides competitiveness to the region, and of course the American economy is becoming more competitive as a result of this, to compete against other regions like the European or some Asian regions. And so when you hear that NAFTA was the worst thing that could ever happen to the US, it's very sad. I'm not going to make any statement about the candidates, although I would like to, but I'm not going to make any statement of the candidates. I'm going to be very careful on that one. But what is clear is that it's a very disinformed debate. It's just I would say, a rhetoric that is going to be very dangerous for the future. My feeling, and I'm perfectly honest on this, is that damage has been done. I don't think the damage is going to disappear on November the 9th. I think the US government and the Canadian government, and I was talking to Mick about this, on November the 9th, some of this damage has to be resolved. But to me, it's obvious when you look at the results that free trade has helped the region, and of course, Mexico has improved dramatically thanks to NAFTA.
Could I just butt
Please.
into this? So, thanks for not maligning my party's nominee, by the way. I really appreciate that. I won't be voting for him, by the way. But
People are changing their mind by the day.
Yeah, no, I know. I change my mind by the day. I'm going to talk about that in the panel that Mickey and I are going to do after lunch. But let me just say that to sort of build on Jaime's arguments here, the empirical evidence is abundantly clear about the improvements that have come about because of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I admit, when we were in the midst of debate in the Congress on it, some of us may have exaggerated the benefits, but clearly those who were predicting gloom and doom were so wrong. I mentioned last night at our dinner, we recall in 1992, before the students here were born, the fact that we had Ross Perot and Al Gore debating this issue, and Ross Perot on CNN famously described as what we will hear as a giant sucking sound of all of these jobs going from the United States to Mexico. And let me say that the thing that troubles me most is that people say that trade agreements are responsible for all of this displacement. And I say that is wrong. Trade agreements are in fact the antidote to the displacement that takes place. The displacement takes place for two reasons. Number one, technology. Technological advances that have taken place clearly have changed our lives, and there are people who lose their job because of technological advances. That gets, not only, we've had David Ricardo, but of course we have Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. So you take comparative advantage and creative destruction, put that together, it is a fact of life. I mean, I am it's nothing new, I'm a self-described Luddite when it comes to technology. And I've had to deal with the challenges, and it all is rooted into that gang of people who in the middle part of the 18th century were rolling over sewing machines because they didn't want to put the sewing business out. Changes take place, it is a fact of life. I argue that if we, the United States of America, don't shape the global economy, we will be shaped by it. The second thing is globalization itself. Globalization is another fact of life. That's what creates the displacement. So, before the North American Free Trade Agreement, any business, to point to a few, Carrier Air Conditioning in Indiana, or Ford Motor Company, they could move to Mexico. Nothing before NAFTA prevented them from being able to do that. But let's remember, before NAFTA, the average tariff on US goods going into Mexico was 12.4%. At the same time, the average tariff on Mexican goods coming into the United States was 4.3%. So we had a tariff rate that was 2.5 times greater on US goods getting into Mexico than it was on Mexican goods coming into the United States. And so while our economy obviously is significantly larger than Mexico's, and Mexico by virtue of that would be a greater beneficiary overall economically, the fact of the matter is we benefited from having greater access to the consumer market in Mexico. So the agreements themselves respond to technology and globalization. And that's why I believe that we are seeing a gross mischaracterization taking place on both sides in this debate. When I listened to those in the media, thoughtful people, I was watching 60 Minutes the other day, and they were talking about it just this week, and they said, that, interviewing these voters in Ohio in this particular area, and they said the reporter said trade agreements have created this displacement. And again, I feel very, very passionately about this, that the trade agreements are in fact a response to the challenges that exist there. And as far as the standard of living, just to give you some empirical evidence, the Woodrow Wilson Center did a study. The average Mexican lived in a one-room home 25 years ago. Today, the average Mexican, and I'm very pleased that we have the Consul General here, the ambassador who's with us today, the average Mexican family lives in a three-room home as opposed to a one-room home before the North American Free Trade Agreement. We obviously have difficulties among our countries, and I think that it's really, really important for us to recognize and focus on those, but there has been dramatic improvement. And I also have to say that while I'm not an economist, brilliant minds think a lot. When we were in the midst of working on laying the groundwork for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which Canada, the United States, and Mexico were all a part, and we began the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, TTIP, I said exactly what Jaime has just said. I said, we should not be negotiating alone, the United States with the European Union. We should take this wonderful bloc that we have of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, that was, as I said in my opening remarks, first envisaged by Ronald Reagan in 1979, and utilize that to link up Europe and the entire hemisphere here.
Well, I would just add to what you said, David, that Mexico and Canada are the number one or number two destinations, export destinations, for 30 out of the 50 U.S. states. Since NAFTA entered into force, U.S. manufacturing exports to Mexico and Canada have increased by 285%. And on the point of competitiveness that Jaime was making, NAFTA imports have increased the global competitiveness of American businesses. 60% of U.S. imports from Canada and Mexico are used in the production of American goods and services that are subsequently exported. So again, abundant empirical evidence of what Jaime and David just said.
So this, I think, is a good point to transition to sort of the second theme of our panel, because this all sounds very good, and yet we're experiencing a populist backlash against trade. So as we sort of look at this, I thought, David, I'd start off by sort of pitching this to you, which is, and I think this is kind of what I want to focus the rest of our time on. And by the way, Professor Courser, if you could give me hand signals when we are getting close to the end, because I missed the start time of our panel. Thank you.
How much longer do we have?
How much longer do we have, Professor Courser? 35 minutes, thank you. So
I can clear my throat.
that's perfect. So I guess the question that I sort of posed to you, David, initially is, as we look at this populist backlash, and Dalibor, I'm going to turn to you after this to talk a bit about this kind of in a sort of a more international context, but clearly there are costs associated with trade, as you said. There are beneficiaries and there are people who lose from trade agreements, even if the net effect is positive.
I don't believe they lose from the agreements themselves.
Fair point.
Yeah.
I guess that's my question. The question is, do you think the perception that the populist backlash is driven by the distribution of the costs of trade is an accurate one? And if it's not, what do you think is driving it?
So, first of all, the word populism is leading. That's the title of this whole forum today. And I believe, and one of my Democratic colleagues from North Carolina, a very close friend of mine who's a political scientist, David Price, just wrote me an email. I hope that we can get him here for a program in the future. He and I established the House Democracy Partnership, which is a completely different issue. But he wrote me something that I believe very fervently, and that is there is a very strong populist argument that can be made in favor of trade agreements. Why is that? Well, I've had debates with Jimmy Hoffa Jr. and Richard Trumka on television on, I can never understand why it is, and this is something that my friend Mickey has to contend with. It's a force within the Democratic Party, but why it is that organized labor has not been supportive of these agreements. I use the example of just Mexico alone. When we had a 12.4% average tariff on U.S. goods going to Mexico, juxtaposed to a 4.3% tariff on Mexican goods coming to the United States before the North American Free Trade Agreement, it stands to reason that we were in fact going to be beneficiaries for union workers. So I was going to leave the Congress after 30 years after the '08 election, and I decided to stay for a couple of reasons. One of them was the fact that we had pending the Colombia, Panama, and South Korea free trade agreements. And I was one of the ringleaders, and some people had encouraged me to stay. So I ran another term because I wanted to make sure that we got those things through. Well, the Colombia agreement, and Colombia's been in the news lately, of course, with the vote that basically disagreed with the agreement that the government had put together with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. And one of the things that we battled through this agreement with Colombia was, again, this whole notion of the loss of jobs. Union workers with Westinghouse, manufacturing in Ohio, washing machines and dryers, Eric. We look at John Deere tractor, Caterpillar tractor in Peoria, Illinois. They, with 40 million consumers in Colombia, have been able to see their wage rates and market opportunities increased for their union members. So let me tell you what I did. When we were debating the NAFTA, again, going back to the late 1980s when this process began, I actually went before two of the large business groups, the Business Roundtable and the Business Council, and I talked with the business community here about some things that needed to be done, because it all comes down to what Hiram and I and everybody in this room is focused on: education. It all comes down to education. So what I advocated, I wrote a piece that actually I've been looking for in probably 1992 or 3, somewhere in the early to mid 90s, in which I advocated that the business community not have just a focus on trade agreements before a vote is taking place in Congress. Because, Mickey and Jaime and Guillermo did the work on this, and then, I was charged as one of the Republican ringleaders to make this happen in the Congress. And so we had to rally the business community and get people educated and focused on it. Well, the case that I was making is we need to have a year in, year out, month in, month out, week in, week out, day in, day out campaign educating the American people, and specifically the workforce, of the benefits here. So one of the things that I advocated to the CEOs, the Business Roundtable, is that they take the paychecks that they provided. Obviously, people are paid differently now, but this was going back, 20 years. On the pay stub that they provide to their union worker, they should have a message that talks about the amount that they are paid that comes from the fact that they're engaged in global trade. And a lot of these CEOs said yes, but guess what? More than a few said no. You know why? They were in the midst of labor negotiations, and for that reason, they were concerned about it. And so the real problem I've had is this massive disconnect between the Richard Trumkas and the James Hoffas, the leadership of the union movement and rank and file union members who are brought to this point. The other thing is that we obviously are living with a great deal of uncertainty today. And you look throughout, again, world history. The first reaction when you're dealing with great uncertainty is to pull up the drawbridge. And that's why it's so important. That's why we wanted to have this forum today. That's why it's important that we educate and fight against it. And so I'd like to think that from this and the other panel, that we're going to be able to shed some light on this issue. And again, the other thing that I think is important is the American people have this goal of seeing the two parties work together. I mean, I am a huge Mickey Cantor fan, as we all know, and he and I share that. He's a strong Democrat. He was chairman of Bill Clinton's campaign and obviously served, as I said, in 2 cabinet posts in the Bill Clinton administration. And yet he and I were able to work so closely together. I mean, he joked with me the other day that he obviously got more support from me than he did from members of his own party in this effort. And I mean, while that is true, I still worked crawling along to try and get more and more Democrats to join us. Worked with President Clinton and with Mickey and others because this traditionally has been a Republican issue. The free trade issue is traditionally a Republican one, and that's why, to me, in many ways, Eric, I feel like I'm living in a Kafkaesque world. I mean, I've gone back and started reading Franz Kafka, because when I think about these two issues of trade and immigration, which are closely linked, I mean, there are more people going from the United States to Mexico than from Mexico coming to the United States, and you would think that we are being overrun, taken over today. Similarly, if you look at the fact that we have in excess of $1 billion a day in cross-border commerce between the United States and Mexico, in excess of $1 billion a day, and you would think that we've all had our lives ground to a halt because of this. So it all comes down very simply to education and thinking of creative ways in which we can make the awareness of these facts, have it brought to the broad body politic.
So I'm going to do two things. Jaime, I want to go to you, and then right after Dalibor, I want to I'll give you a quick setup on this question before, which is I want to talk about how this is playing out in the EU. Okay. Because, Jaime, and then
I just wanted to make a point about David's comments. The first one is that in Mexico, wages that are paid to workers involved in exports, defined as a net exporting company, as a company that exports more than 0.5% of its production, are 30% higher than the average.
There's 17% here.
And 70 here. So that is, I think, a very important element when you talk about it. And the second issue, let me just say, please go to page 2 of that thing, and then look at graphs O and P, which I think is very important for the discussion. And what you see is that manufacturing GDP in the US has been going down. If you look at the graph that says sector production as percentage of GDP, manufacturing, that is the blue line, dotted blue line, has been going down since 1980. And to the right of that graph, you have what has happened to import tariffs in the US from 1980 to today, and nothing has changed. So the two series are not highly correlated. Mm-hmm. Apparently, the decrease in production share in manufacturing is explained, as you were saying, for a different reason, but not by the trade regime that the US is imposing. So look, it's quite surprising to see that the tariffs in that graph are pretty much constant over the last 30 years, or 30 plus years, and manufacturing production has going down, and other sectors have been going up.
I think on that note, you could actually look at the share of manufacturing on global GDP, and you would get a very similar graph. I mean, that share has been going down. So it's not that a fixed number of jobs are being redistributed through trade. It's that the global economy is undergoing structural change, and yes, there are winners and losers, and we have to have policies that that do take the concerns of those left behind seriously and put in place mechanisms for social mobility and enable them to accumulate human capital, etc. But there is, protectionism is never the right answer.
No.
You are not going to get good results by erecting trade barriers.
Yeah, Donald Trump advocating that we slap on a 35% tariff on carrier air conditioning if they open up their operation in Mexico to the United States, and everybody applauds the fact that they're going to see an increase in the cost of their air conditioners is something I find slightly, troubling. And
avocados.
job training.
Avocados.
Yeah,
that now are suffering here. There are around Professor Camp was giving me the results. They are selling the avocado for $1.70, one avocado. Mm. And the reason is that we have a strike in Mexico.
So we won't be having avocado for lunch today, I guess.
The point, we have a strike in Mexico. So let's take the scenario where the strike is gone. Mm-hmm. We go back to normal, and then Mr. Trump introduces a tariff on avocados. U.S. consumers are going to suffer. They're already, you have examples of that here, right?
So Dalibor, let me pitch this back to you, because we've had a very sort of North American perspective up to this point on these costs and benefits, and yet we've had this striking example of Brexit, where what you were describing as kind of the most integrated, presumably if we believe the sort of the Ricardo story, as you said, just because it was sort of hundreds of years ago doesn't mean it's not true, and yet we just had a vote in the European Union by one of its sort of key member states to exit. So I guess the question is this: do you think there's a parallel here for sort of what's going on kind of around the world? Is this something unique? I guess I'd like to get a European perspective.
I think it's clear that we are living through a populist moment of some sort, that there is a backlash against political elites across the Western world, across liberal democracies. And I think there is a confluence of different factors responsible for this. There is almost a perfect storm of many different things, including the structural change that perhaps might be leaving some people behind, including the change in journalism, the way we process information and are able to distinguish disinformation and propaganda from true knowledge. But I'm not convinced, actually, that trade and a backlash against trade per se is playing an important role in this. So there's a growing literature on drivers of populism, both in the Anglosphere and also in continental Europe, and you get mixed results in terms of what explains the share of votes going to, say, far right or far left populist parties, but very rarely you would get a sort of strong, robust explanation built around purely economic measures. So the sort of losers of globalization revolting hypothesis does not really hold. And you look at, I'll get to Brexit in a moment, but I think there's an even more interesting sort of recent episode that has to do with trade and populism, and that's CETA and TTIP and the attitudes in the European Union. So the first side, it looks like there is this massive popular backlash against concluding a trade agreement with the United States and with Canada in the European Union. But if you look at the polls, most of the European public is actually in support of concluding this trade agreement. So, and in some countries, if you look at Denmark or Sweden or the Baltic states, the margins are really high. So you have 70% of the Irish, 77% of Lithuanians in favor of concluding a trade agreement with the United States. What has happened was that in one key country, namely Germany, there has been a concerted, well-organized, extremely well-executed disinformation campaign that has taken place over the past 2 years that resembles in many ways actually what we know from Russia as the trademark Kremlin disinformation campaigns, Kremlin propaganda behave in the same way. So you had numerous fake stories about the prospective effects of TTIP on health standards, consumer standards, stories about chlorinated chicken flooding our supermarkets and hormone-fed beef, etc., etc. Although, I mean, and none of these were factually correct. When you look at the Canadian agreement, does not even cover much of the agriculture sector. TTIP does cover some, but there is no in no version of the agreement there'll be a commitment of the European Union to reduce its existing health and consumer protection standards. Yet these stories, this concerted scaremongering that's been going on for 2 years have eroded popular support for these trade agreements in Germany and in Austria. Nobody in those countries is willing and able to speak against that because it has become so politically toxic. And we need to, I think free marketeers need to realize that we are fighting in a way an uphill battle, that the opponents are not always playing fair, and we need to take that challenge seriously.
So let me, Professor Corser, what is my clock? Very good. So Guillermo, I wanted to turn to you on a question, and then if we have time, I want to get back to Brexit, because I think you think this is a sort of a separate event in some sense. But before we do that, I wanted to just bring up the sort of the entry of China into the WTO and sort of China's sort of role in the world economy, which is sort of a singular event for a country that large to sort of become that integrated that quickly in the world economy. And so I thought if you were willing to just speak a little bit to the question, is that different, or should we think about that as we've thought about previous sort of trade arrangements? I mean, is China a singular event, something that we should treat differently than the way we think about NAFTA or European integration or something like that?
Well, China is certainly a considerable event, but I think it's a positive that it is now brought into a rules-based system that introduces discipline into the way the Chinese treat imports in particular. So, and that is, that is one of the advantages that is frequently neglected of NAFTA. By introducing rules that would now govern trade among the three countries in North America, we have really shifted the paradigm from a world in which our trade was anemic and we had multiple trading disputes and a long list of irritants with the US, to a system in which we have thriving trade and hardly any disputes. And so at least in that respect, I see the incorporation of a major player into a rules-based system as a positive.
I would add something to that, if I may.
Please.
Right now, we're expecting a discussion and a decision in the WTO if China will be declared as a market economy. And it's a very tricky discussion because it's clear to many players that still the formation of prices in China doesn't respond necessarily to market forces, but rather by other forces and other criteria. And they are, they have very distorted relative prices in China. So I think that Guillermo's point is very true. A rules-based system is much more efficient and lowers transaction costs and promotes trade flows. The key is that we understand that if China doesn't get into that sort of market-oriented price fixing, the fact that we appoint them or that we accept them as a market economy within the WTO can bring some serious distortions to trade.
Can I just, this is again one of the things of which I'm very proud. Mickey had left the administration, but the work had begun on China's accession to the World Trade Organization. This was just before President Clinton left office. We were able to work in a bipartisan way to make this happen. I am in no way an apologist for China. I recognize human rights issues, even currency issues, intellectual property theft. There are all kinds of very, very serious, the South China Sea, you can go through the litany of problems that exist there. But a week ago last Saturday, actually 2 weeks ago today, the Nixon Library reopened. Huge new operation there. And I wasn't able to be there for that, but the next morning I had a 2-hour breakfast with Dr. Henry Kissinger. And we talked about the world, and we had a long, long discussion about China. And I said, so Henry, tell me what is the greatest surprise that has taken from when you, with the Shanghai community, went there in the early 70s with Nixon and all. And he said the greatest surprise clearly was the economic growth that has taken place in China. He did not anticipate that. If you go back 3 decades, and again, this gets in, I'm not comparing Mexico to China, don't worry, Jaime or Guillermo, but I will say that if you look at the economic growth that has come because of commerce, it clearly has, there have been tremendous strides. And so again, this notion of slapping on a tariff is absolutely crazy. And so when I have people, like Donald Trump and others who make the argument that we need to retaliate in some way, I ask the question, what is it that you want to do? I did have some colleagues in the Congress, Eric, who, when we saw the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the Soviet Union, they wanted China to become the next Soviet Union. And Jill Stark has a long history of having been there. She clearly has seen tremendous change that has taken place. And in most areas, it is positive. And I will also say that I do know that the Chinese leadership, I've just completed making a movie that's designed to shatter myths that exist in China about the United States and myths that exist in the United States about China. And it has to do with Smithfield, job displacement. Just one little tiny anecdote on this. There are many people in this country who believe that China has this plot to take American jobs. And yet, if you go into the Midwest in China, there right now are protests taking place. Why? Because shoe manufacturing in China has been transferred to Ethiopia. And so this is all part of globalization. So we, in the movie that my colleague Bill Mundell and I have made, and it should be out before too long. In fact, he's meeting with Wan Jianlin right now, meeting with him today in China, who has Wanda, about distributing it throughout there. And it gets again to our whole point on education. We need to recognize that while there are problems, we need to clarify a lot of the facts here.
So I think we've got time for maybe one more question, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. But I thought I would pose this first to Dalibor and then kind of to the whole panel. But and it's kind of a transition into our politics one. But that, David, your sort of view, and it's my view as well, but I'll play devil's advocate for a moment, is that a lot of this is misinformation. A lot of this is that there are costs associated with trade, and that as people sort of realize what the benefits are, sort of trade will sort of grow and support. And I feel like for those of us that live in what I'll call the cosmopolitan parts of the United States, the parts where we are very integrated into the world economy, we have lots of people from sort of other countries, we travel to other countries, we tend to look at the person who loses their job in Canton, Ohio, and say, well, if we could just get some of the benefits to globalization to them, they would feel different about trade. If we could sort of explain to them how, if we could sort of reduce barriers to mobility or something like that. What shook my faith a little bit was an NPR interview, and I guess I just identified myself as a coastal elite by mentioning NPR. But I was listening to an NPR interview, and they had an interview with someone from Central Ohio, and this is why I think cues to the Brexit question. And they asked him why he was a Trump supporter. And he said, well, I lost my job in the auto parts plant to NAFTA. And they said, well, then what happened? He said, well, then I got a job in furniture manufacturing, and I lost that to when the plant moved to China. And the NPR reporter now says, well, what happened next? And you can tell the anticipation is now I work in a car wash and I have much lower wages. He said, no, I went back to college, I became an electrical engineer, and I now work in a plant that largely exports electronics to China. And you could see the confusion, hear the confusion in the person's voice. And finally she blurts out, well, why are you a Trump supporter? And he said, oh, no one should ever lose a job to a foreigner. And I thought, okay, that's not the view that we're articulating here. So I start with Dalibor because I feel like that characterizes at least what I was hearing from Brexiteers sort of, and I guess the question for those of us, as we talk about this education campaign that David's mentioning is, how do we react to people that, and maybe you disagree with this premise, that want a more homogeneous, more closed world, that feel threatened by globalization, not because they're bearing the cost, but just because they feel threatened by globalization, they don't want their plumber to be Polish?
Yeah, no, I think that's in a way that's a very deep question, and maybe I would like to sort of talk very briefly about Brexit first, and then go back to the deep question, which I think is very interesting in its own right. There is no question about the fact that Brexit is the Donald Trump of England. It is part of the very same populist momentum, the very same campaigning style and substance that you've seen on both sides of the Atlantic. However, one important difference I think is that the Leave campaign, the effort for the UK to leave the European Union, cannot really be characterized as a backlash against the European single market. Even the most ardent supporters of Leave would recognize that there are massive benefits to the UK's being part of the European single market. And now we'll see how things will play out. Maybe UK will have to actually opt for hard Brexit. I mean, the sort of political trade-offs are complicated, but it's not something that even sort of the most fervent Eurosceptics would be willing to do deliberately. It's going to be, but it has to be said, it is going to be disruptive for the course of free trade. Most importantly, because of the disruption to the EU-UK trade links, if they leave the single market, the non-tariff barriers that are going to reappear. But in the long term, the damage could be done to the European project by not having the British voice at the table. Traditionally, Brits were among the more market-friendly, more sort of pro-open market forces in the European project, and without them, it's very easy to imagine that a Europe run by the French and Italians will turn its back to the rest of the world. To your deep question, just one thought that I have is that we need to I suppose, be better at making the intellectual case for creative destruction, for market-tested innovation, for the disruption that it brings about. And maybe a lesson for people who are like myself on the free market conservative side of the spectrum is that maybe we should look somewhat differently at the role of social safety nets. And maybe this, something I've seen in America for the past couple of years, this deliberate war waged against the safety net is not the best thing strategically if you are simultaneously going to make the case for a world that's globalized, complex, and uncertain, and involves a lot of change and complexity.
Could I just, to your point, as you were playing the counter there, that I think that job training is very important. There need to be government programs that deal with this displacement. And so, as one who was part of the coastal elite on both coasts, I will say that there are steps that need to be taken. But again, I just get back to the point that obviously globalization is a fact of life. Technological advances are a fact of life. And the agreements themselves have addressed these issues. When we did the NAFTA, we focused on job retraining. I mean, that was part of it. I mean, that was the way to build votes from some in the Midwest who recognize displacement is taking place and more needs to be done.
Do I
Let
have
me
time?
use one question,
Please.
one comment quickly about Brexit. The Brits that are for Brexit now and the leaders are looking forward to redefine their relationship with the rest of Europe.
Right.
And what they have in mind is a NAFTA type of agreement.
Yeah.
So that's very telling. So the Brits want to move from that union or that union that is very strong to a free trade agreement very much a la NAFTA.
Do we have time for questions?
We do have time for questions. Unfortunately, we're maxed out on microphones, so when you ask your question,
So let's do the following. I'll trade with you.
Okay.
There you go.
What are we doing here?
You're putting that microphone on, and I'm walking out into the audience. We're an all-service shop here at the Dreier Roundtable.
This question is primarily for Dalibor, but the other panelists. Do you think Brexit would have occurred if there hadn't been the Syrian refugee crisis?
It's very difficult to play with counterfactuals, but it's clear that the timing of that massive influx of people into continental Europe last year played a role. And it's at the same time quite paradoxical because the UK is not part of the Schengen area of free movement of people. The UK has control of its own borders. British authorities can even send away EU citizens who are trying to get into the UK, and there'll be a number of them sent back on public health or national security grounds. So the UK was not affected at all, really, by the refugee crisis, but the vivid pictures and the terror attacks in Brussels and Paris, I mean, all of that really played into the narrative of the Leave campaign, and I would say quite unfortunately.
What do you see as the future of the Schengen Agreement? I mean, are there any modifications that you think could take
Well,
place?
there
there?
already are modifications being introduced, so countries have introduced temporary border controls. I think for me, Schengen, I'm somebody who was raised on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and for me, the accession to the EU and being able to travel without the passport to Western Europe, that's something that the generation of my parents really considered a massive achievement, and it would have been unheard of only 20 years ago. So for me, the symbolic value of Schengen is really important. Mm-hmm. If it's going to survive the current crisis, we'll have to, I think about federalism seriously in Europe, about what it is that we expect the EU to do and what it is that we expect national governments to do. The problem with Schengen is that you have a movement, area for free movement of people without passports, and then you leave border protection in the hands of individual states. And when a million people show up in Greece, we sort of say that that's a Greek problem. And that was clearly not sustainable last year, and it's not going to be sustainable going forward. So there are some efforts to coordinate and to spend more money on that, but I think ultimately there needs to be a EU-wide agreement on border protection, asylum, refugee policy, and perhaps even on immigration policy at some point. And that sounds positively utopian in the present political environment, but the alternative really is to go back to a Europe where there'll be passport checks at every border.
Thank you so much for speaking. I feel like any current diagnosis of the populist movement in America, at least your diagnosis of the populist movement in America has ignored the increasing wealth inequality in America. So I just would like to ask a question to anybody who wants to answer it. If there is any sort of relationship between these free trade agreements and wealth inequality.
Well, I mean, I will just say that obviously that is an issue that both political parties have recognized as a priority. In fact, in the presidential campaign, my former colleague Marco Rubio had stepped forward and has done a great deal of work on this, and Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, has done so as well. So there is recognition of this issue. Exactly how you deal with it is obviously a challenge, and I do think that has played a role in exacerbating this high level of frustration and the political furor that is there, is the haves and the have-nots. I mean, the first person to really come forward with this in the presidential campaign when John Edwards talked about two Americas. And so it continues to be an issue. It does need to be addressed. And that's why I think an argument can be made, from my perspective, that taking steps that enhance greater opportunity, ending a cycle of dependence, will play a big role in narrowing that gap.
I actually think that inequality per se is somewhat overrated as an explanatory factor in all this. I think most envy is local. We don't really, few of us I think would be concerned about how many yachts Bill Gates has. If we are concerned by something, it's about I mean, the way the economic game is set up, whether everybody is being treated fairly or not, whether everybody has a chance at success. I mean, you look at data. I've been doing some work on drivers of populism in Europe. You look at 1980 to 2016, the share of populist vote in different countries, and there is actually, I don't see the link between simple measures of inequality, Gini coefficients, and support for populist parties. So I think the story is somewhat more complicated than a widening difference between the rich and the poor.
If you bring some economic analysis to this question, which I think is a very good question, by the way, what happens is when the economy is highly protected, the tendency is to produce lower volumes of production because you are attempting to supply your own market, and big margins of capital gains, because entrepreneurs do not have to compete as much. When you open up, then the volume of production goes up because now you are serving your own market plus other markets, and the fact that the volume grows becomes accompanied with the decrease of the margins. So if there is a link, it will be the other way around. That is that when you open up, you operate in a larger volume with more employment and with lower capital gains because they need to compete. That's the evidence that I have found in the Mexican case.
Of course.
Hi, my name is Edgar Warnholtz, and I guess this question is more for my fellow Mexicans, but when talking about free trade agreements, as Guillermo mentioned, as the free flow of goods, services, information, technology, and people, there seem to be exceptions.
And capital.
And capital as well, when talking about natural resources. So for example, in Mexico, we have Pemex, which is a large monopoly over, is or was, depending on how you look at it, a large monopoly over the oil in Mexico, yet we don't have the technology or the capital to refine our own oil, and it is sold to the US, refined, and then sold back at a higher price. And although the tariff doesn't exist when coming back into Mexico, those higher prices are reflected. So I guess my question is, what is the linkages, or what is missing from NAFTA or other free trade agreements that talk to natural resources and the national use of those?
Well, when NAFTA was negotiated, the three parties, Mexico, Canada, and the US, recognize the Mexican monopoly as written in the Mexican Constitution. So not just oil, but other sectors as well. However, a provision was included in NAFTA that to the extent that Mexico liberalized its constitutional restrictions, that then Pemex and Mexico would come under the discipline of NAFTA. And that's exactly what happened when Mexico liberalized the energy sector a couple of years ago. And so, for example, today, the government procurement chapter of NAFTA has become fully applicable to the public bidding of deep water projects, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico. And you have US companies participating in deep water projects under the discipline of NAFTA. Now, those companies, whoever wins those public bids, will bring their technology in and will be able to extract oil at very profound depths in a way that to date Pemex has not been able to do so. With respect to refining capacity, the refining capacity, and I think Jaime and I looked at this issue very closely a few years ago, the refining capacity for Mexican heavy oil in the US is limited. And in fact, at the time, there was only one refinery in Pascagoula in Louisiana that was able to process Mexican heavy crude. So our ability to export oil for purposes of refinement is limited by that capacity in the US. There's a project to build another refinery in Mexico, and there might be foreign direct investment in refining as well as a result of Mexico's energy reform. But
The U.S. will be involved in that, clearly.
and the U.S. will be involved in that.
Well, one thing that might be relevant for you is that, as Guillermo was saying, NAFTA contemplates a very important mechanism to protect investors, and which is something that Guillermo designed. And if the U.S. was to leave NAFTA, all the American investors that are established in Mexico would lose that protection, including the oil investment. So it's not only that the tariffs, the way you were describing, David, is that NAFTA has created an ecosystem full of rules that promote growth, and the investment of Americans going into Mexico has been huge. It's around 80% of all the capital we receive from the world. And if the U.S. leaves NAFTA, all that protection that today they enjoy will be gone.
So just to give an example, in deep water, the investment is front-loaded. So oil companies spend billions of dollars exploring and finding the oil, and once they find it, they need about 30 years to recover their investment and make a profit. You try to identify any period of 30 years in Mexican history with stability. And therefore, the value of investment protection is considerably high.
And on that note, I think we need to bring this.
Can I just share a little email,
Can I-
Eric, with you? Yeah, just it'll take
Is it possible for me not to stop?
Yeah,
No.
no, you can't stop.
Go ahead, David, I'm kidding.
So there's a woman called Meredith Broadbent who is, I think Mickey may remember, she was a staff member on the Trade Subcommittee. She's now a member of the International Trade Commission. I invited her, she participated in our program in Washington on polarization last year, and she sent me this email, and this is targeted towards all of the undergraduates here. She just said, hey, thanks very much for sending this, looks really good, a fresh approach which is not happening in Washington, D.C. these days. It seems to me that if the young California digital trade types can't get more energized in a constructive direction on trade, any new trade agreements will be a long time in coming. So it's very important the discussions like these are going on in California with the next generation of students. And so, here's a member of the International Trade Commission who is sitting there dealing with all this frustration, saying this all falls on the shoulders of CMC undergraduates. Okay, so we're counting on you.
I can't think of a better way to end this panel. If you join me in thanking our distinguished guests.